Good evening, I'm Kevin Cody. I'm the publisher of Easy Reader. With me are Jonatan, Cvetko, and Russ Gilbert. They are opponents to the 3 cannabis measures on the ballots in Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach, and Redondo Beach. We also invited Elliot Lewis, who is the proponent of the 3 measures and was the primary sponsor of the 3 measures. He declined to participate because he feels Easy Reader's coverage in print of his company and the initiatives especially has been unfair, something we dispute. But that leaves us with no proponents for the measures for this evening's discussion. Nevertheless, I'm hopeful that Jonatan and Russ will be able to provide you with information that's helpful before you go to the ballot. And I'm going to let them introduce one another, or themselves, actually. So, Jonatan, you want to start?
Thank you, Chris. My name is Jonatan Cvetko. I'm a resident of Redondo Beach. I am also the executive director of the United Cannabis Business Association. It's a nonprofit cannabis advocacy organization where we work on a lot of local and state level policy promoting responsible cannabis policies as needed. I myself am against these measures, as Kevin had mentioned earlier. Thank you very much.
I'm Russ Gilbert. I'm a Hermosa resident. I was on the Hermosa Cannabis Committee during the time that council was looking into this, and I came away with a very strong no on M opinion. To be clear, I am pro-legalization, I am pro-delivery, I am pro-dispensary even. I just think this specific measure is not right for Hermosa Beach.
Okay, let me ask the most obvious question, and it's that in 2016, the state voted to legalize it. Hermosa and Manhattan Redondo, I think, all voted in favor of it. The councils have all passed ordinances prohibiting retail sales of cannabis. So Catalyst has proposed a ballot measure, which is the only way to circumvent council's disinclination to legalize it. So why not pass the measures? Jonatan?
There's a number of reasons why not to pass the measures. I think something to kind of first put a little bit more context into that. We did pass Prop 64 in 2016, but legal sales did not begin until 2018. So we haven't actually had this long period of time to where people kind of have this perception of how legal things have been for a while. Keeping in mind that we also lost 2 years with COVID for cities to actually progress and adopt local regulations. The state failed in doing a better job in educating local jurisdictions on how to adopt regulations. And we hadn't had the same leadership on a county level as well. I've had the opportunity to work with many of our local cities over these years, which is why we, in Redondo Beach in 2018, actually, the council had passed to set up an advisory committee. And in 2019, we had set up that advisory committee and I served on that. So Redondo Beach has actually been working on this for quite a number of years. And the goal was to actually have this introduced and adopted by spring of 2020, fall of 2020 at the latest, but COVID did delay us in that process.
And Hermosa had an advisory committee you served on as well, right? And what was its position on retail sale? What was its recommendation to council?
Recommendation to council was to lift the ban on delivery, and that was split, and then not to pass Measure M. The thing that everybody across the spectrum. So we had some moderates such as myself. We had an industry owner on the committee, and we had a very outspoken anti-cannabis activist who a lot of us didn't get along with directly, just because her opinion was so different from ours. But when you got down to, is Measure M good for the city, that's pretty much the one thing everybody agreed on.
But you're specific to Measure M. Did the advisory committee oppose retail sales?
There was a split vote on that, and I honestly don't remember how so there was a unanimous vote not to do. I don't know that we were posed the question exactly like that. When we spoke with the city, the reason that the ban was put into place in the first place is there's a lot that you need to figure out for retail sales. There's security. There's making sure that advertising doesn't affect children. There is the tax ramifications. There's other law enforcement ramifications. There's just a ton of it. And so it was much easier for a city when it passed to say, you know what, we're not going to do this right now. We're going to leave it banned until we have time to figure it out.
How does that differ from alcohol sales, cigarette sales? that cities have figured out long ago?
Well, for starters, there's the fact that because of the regulatory kind of, how's a nice way to put it, confusion. Regulatory confusion at the state and county level and federal level, of course. A lot of cannabis operators haven't been able to get bank accounts. So they have a ton of cash on hand. And that is an incredible target for organized crime and just people who are looking to make a lot of money. So if you've got 20 grand of cash in your register because you can't take credit cards, it's a pretty tempting target to show up in there. Then you've got to figure out things like signage. So with bars and restaurants, you've got years and years of history and experience on regulating those things. You have the conditional use permit. You have alcohol licenses. You know where the boundary of state, federal, and local law enforcement and local regulations are. None of that exists yet for cannabis. So it's not that it's necessarily going to be different. It's just that nobody has that figured out. Then there's a ton of data that doesn't really exist. You can't test for cannabis under the influence the way that you can for driving under the influence. Just things like that. So there's a lot that's different, even though it should probably be regulated similarly.
What was Redondo's advisory committee's advice to council?
Ours was actually to start with what you would probably equate to being a pilot program. So we said to start with actual shops, and we're going to allow for retail shops. We want to start with 2, but not cap it at that, because we recognize there might be a need in the future to do more than 2. We also have learned from some of the mistakes of other types of businesses, such as massage parlors and otherwise, to where you try to regulate one way, not realizing what some of the unfortunate or unforeseen consequences could be on that. And by being able to do it through an ordinance as opposed to an initiative like what these measures are doing, the council has the actual opportunity to change those things at the will of the council as opposed to constantly going back to the measure for it.
So Redondo's approved sale out of 2 retailers, correct?
Yes. So, well, what we've done, we've passed our ordinance now, and we're going to start with that program.
Now, why is that preferable to measure? What's the measure?
Measure E in Redondo.
E in Redondo Beach.
Excellent. No, it's preferable for a number of reasons. One, we ended up actually including a way to be able to collect any kind of tax or fee revenues off of these sales in here. So having the allowance of any kind of legal cannabis activities means that you're going to have some kind of enforcement liabilities. You need to be able to have some funding come in there to offset those. It's just something that's just a responsible thing to do. The businesses will want it themselves. Within the Redondo ordinance, we put in a development agreement of 5%, which is essentially equivalent to a tax. That tax is actually proven to be one of the more lower taxes actually in the county here, to where the city of Los Angeles, which is the closest one here that has any legal shops, is actually at 10%.
But didn't Redondo already pass an excise tax on cannabis sales?
No, we haven't. So it's come through our actual ordinance right now. So that's one of the reasons on there. The other one is that we get control of where this is going to go. So we had on our advisory committee, we had everything from the police chief to the doctor for the fire to BCHD to the cancer support group, myself and others, and we all end up looking and seeing what was actually the most responsible way to start the program, zoning wise and otherwise. Some of the things that we saw that we thought would be better and more responsible is to not allow for cannabis shops to be on the pier itself. Measure E would actually allow for those shops to be on the pier where families and others are in there, and that was a concern to us.
What's your relationship to Cali? You're head of an association of cannabis sales retailers, correct? Are they a member of your association?
They are not.
And do you see a conflict between your position and opposing their efforts?
Absolutely not. I think, quite frankly, catalysts should be ashamed of themselves to actually say that they're representing what the industry is. This is not at all what the cannabis industry has been looking for. It is not what we have been fighting for. It's not what we have been putting forward as being an image to get rid of what the press prohibition images have been about cannabis. We don't come into communities. We do not actually challenge them. We do not enforce and force our own policies upon the community. What should have been done is similar to what we did in Hermosa Beach and what we did in Redondo Beach, is to invite the residents to come out, have a conversation, set up these advisory committees, and explore what is the best way that the community would want it to come in. But entirely not what catalysts
at least in Hermosa, that effort did not result in the council proposing an alternative measure to legalize cannabis sales.
Not true, and I'll have Russ expand on that, but they didn't put a measure on the ballot. What they saw was actual value to follow what Redondo Beach did, is to actually pass an ordinance. They wanted to be able to regulate this through an ordinance, so they'd have the flexibility to keep growing it and changing it, as opposed to having it locked in with an initiative, the way that these measures would do.
Yeah. So the biggest concerns that were voiced on the committee were, one, we are a small city, much smaller than Redondo. So the idea that it can be equivalent between two cities is probably not right. Redondo is, I don't know, 3-4 times the size of Hermosa, with business districts and much larger spaces between things, whereas we're 1.5 square miles, a little less than that. So it's very hard to not be within, say, 1,500 feet of a school. It's very hard not to be next to a park that kids play, that kind of thing. So that was probably one of the first big considerations that we had.
Can you clarify? Jonatan just said that Hermosa passed an ordinance.
Yeah.
Can you explain that ordinance?
Sure. The ordinance that's passed so far is that the ban on delivery has been lifted. So we identified very early on.
But that's not quite the same as allowing retail sales in town.
It's
Certainly.
not. Well, first off, it is. You can sit at home. I can pick up this phone right here and have marijuana brought to me right now. So that's pretty much, that took away any argument that marijuana wasn't accessible to people who needed it, people who might be elderly or infirm or injured and were using it medicinally.
But I think the emphasis on the 3 initiatives in the 3
Right.
cities is retailers.
Correct.
And the question is, people voted to allow sales. I think you could draw an inference that they expected sales to be allowed in stores,
So they
not
voted,
just by delivery.
they voted to legalize cannabis. They did not vote for anything other than that. They voted, so Prop 64, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you probably know way more about it than I do, that decriminalized recreational use as well as medicinal, and it made it legal where the locals wanted it to be selling. So if I'm right now, so with Prop E in Redondo, I could easily be closer to a Redondo dispensary here in Hermosa than somebody down in Riviera Village. So
We're still addressing the right of someone who's a cannabis grower or seller to open a store like any other company.
Correct.
Allow me to expand on that, actually. When you say retailers, there are 2 versions of retailers. There's what's called the storefront, right? So it'd be a shop that you could walk into. And there's also the non-storefront. It would be, think about more of like a delivery service of any type, if you're going to order food or otherwise on that, right? So you have access. The question here that we had in the cities was about whether or not these cities allowed for access. I want to be very clear to anyone that's watching right now, because the proponents of these measures are trying to tell you that there is no legal access in our cities and that theirs is the only option. That is entirely false. Both Redondo Beach and Hermosa Beach have actively passed ordinances allowing for retail activities.
But let's go back to this distinction. Why wouldn't someone who sells cannabis have the same rights to sell that someone selling alcohol would?
I don't understand your question. What do you mean by that?
Why couldn't someone who sells cannabis and cannabis products open a store the same as someone can open a liquor store?
So nobody has the right to sell alcohol. You have to go through a very rigorous process to get yourself with an alcohol license. Then you have to get a conditional use permit. And I'm not even an expert on this. I'm mostly going off of one of the people on our committee. It was the owner of a alcohol serving establishment here. Then there's a ton of different degrees. So you can be a brewery that only sells beer. You can be a liquor store. You can be a restaurant that has a liquor store permit. All of that has, like, I guess since Prohibition, decades of history and getting those things right. None of that exists yet with Hermosa. So none of those people have the right to have, and that's actually one of the things about the ordinance that's kind of messed up, is a bar owner is permitted, when they follow very specific, very well-documented processes, they are permitted to apply for and maybe receive a liquor license that they then need to maintain and keep up to date. Measure M short circuits that entire process. It basically does give the permit holder a right, and it makes the city prove, it puts the city on the wrong side of it. If one of the bars or restaurants misbehaves, or a liquor store is found to be selling alcohol to a minor or something like that, there's a whole array of regulatory hammers that drop on them. With Measure M, a lot of that is missing. There is really not any provision in there, if memory serves, to have them lose the permit due to bad behavior. They can get fined, although that's not particularly defined. They can get slaps on the wrist and they can get yelled at. But based on the behavior, based on the behavior that we see on social media from these guys, they're very much a ask forgiveness or kind of shrug it off.
Let's assume the measures pass.
Yeah.
And my understanding is it would allow the cities, require the cities to issue 3 permits in Redondo, 2 in Hermosa. At some sort of point system. Can you explain how these retailers these 3 would be chosen in Redondo?
Yeah, so it's a merit-based process where it's been problematic and where each of the city attorneys in all the cities have pointed out as being an issue for them, is that the merit-based process itself is very much favorable to the proponents of the initiative itself. It is something that we do not consider to be potentially constitutional, but in the reality of it, it is actually very discriminatory to where a local resident here couldn't even have a chance to apply in because of the way they set this up.
Yeah, what's going to prohibit a local smoke shop, for example, from applying for one of these?
The $500,000 cash on hand, I think, would be probably the first one.
So several things. Yeah, I think Russ pointed that one out. One of them is, we've seen this as a bad policy in other cities, right? One of the things that the measures in all these cities have done is that they require you to have a property ahead of the licensing. So what that typically does is that incentivizes the landlords as well as the actual people looking for these properties to start being gouged for either pricing or having different problems that lead to lawsuits. We've seen this multiple times where landlords will promise the same property to multiple applicants going forward on that. We're seeing that in the Corona.
Catalyst says, and Catalyst is the proponent of these 3 measures, that they have successfully opened stores in several, I can't remember how many, but I think you mentioned they have 13 dispensaries. Yep. And they don't have a history of problems.
Based on what? They sued nearly every jurisdiction you can. You can Google them yesterday and see that. They keep they're incredibly litigious, and that's one of the ways they hope to win licenses to do that. Yeah. Now, that strategy has been limited to them to being successful, so now they've changed their strategy to come into cities and actually force their own ordinance on them through these measures. We'll see if that's going to be successful for them. They have filed 8 different cities that I'm aware of here. We've stopped them in 5 of them, and now we have the last 3 here in the beach cities to stop them in.
And then what would your group's approach to having retail sales be? How would you get these retail storefronts open?
The first question is not about how we would want it. The question is, what does the community want? This was the whole point of having the advisory committee.
I'm pretty sure that especially small communities like Hermosa, Manhattan, and Redondo, I consider to be a small community, would like access to cannabis in the neighboring town. And so I don't think you're going to find residents in any of these communities welcoming a retail cannabis store in downtown Hermosa, Manhattan, and Redondo.
You might be right, and that was really the whole point. And I want to bring this up. We had the advisory committee of multiple different, perspectives on there, both in Redondo Beach and in Hermosa. And in the end, we came up with what we thought was the best way to start going forward. In Hermosa Beach, that meant allowing for delivery to start here and seeing if that is a responsible thing. If it works well, maybe the city wants to invite other kind of activities coming here, such as a storefront. In Redondo Beach, we saw that there was a reasonable way to approach this by starting with 2 storefronts. And once we see that's good, we can see if we expand that or take that back as well.
LA City has retail sales, correct?
They do.
And is Torrance?
Torrance is not. So there is a shop in Torrance, but it's officially City of Los Angeles.
Okay. So how is the City of Los Angeles able to surmount these untried, undeveloped regulatory issues that you're saying are reasons not to allow retailers to open now?
I'm not saying that they're not doing that. So LA is a very different thing. And I think this is what needs to be explained to everyone. There is not a one size fits all, which is why we've had the difficulty of cities being able to adopt this going forward. So as I said earlier, Hermosa Beach says that they want to start with delivery coming in. Redondo Beach wants to start with 2 shops. In Los Angeles, we had a history where we had a number of semi-legal shops prior to Prop 64, about 160 of them, 135 is the official number, should have been in there. And they actually got grandfathered in. So we've grandfathered those shops in with the passing of their own initiative down over there. And now we have a new program to add more licenses in there that has been delayed for years, that has led also to multiple significant lawsuits because that rollout has not been as easy as people perceive that it should be.
Right. Do you have a ballpark figure for what the revenue would be for if Hermosa, I think Hermosa said they're going to have a 1 to 10% tax. They passed an ordinance that would leave, it's on the ballot, a sales tax on cannabis. And they left the level open. But let's say they settle on 5%, like Redondo. Have there been any figures issued on what Hermosa could expect to receive if these two retailers are allowed to open?
We got a presentation from, of all people, the chief of police of Port Hueneme, and they're apparently raking it in up there in terms of how much they were making. I seem to remember each of those storefronts up there were making in the millions per year.
Yeah.
There's a lot about that city that's similar to ours, but then there's a lot that's different also. Most notably that they were kind of the only zip code in the surrounding Ventura County where you could get legal pot for a while. So that's a little bit different here. I would guess, so this measure would put a dispensary at the north and south end of PCH. Those are the only places in Hermosa that fit the requirements that are in Measure M. And there's speculation that the real estate deals are already underway to get those done. So I would think with the traffic that comes in on, I think the traffic that comes in every day, those shops would do quite well. But I don't think that there's any way to really know until they're actually there.
Question from viewers want to know where the proponents are. Want to remind them?
As I said earlier in the evening, we invited proponents of the three measures, who specifically Elliot Lewis, who is the CEO of Catalyst, which funded and successfully passed the three measures that will be on the November ballot. And he declined because he felt that Easy Reader's reporting on this issue has been unfair, biased against his company, biased against the three measures. I disagree, but I can't compel him to appear. So that's why there's no proponent for the three measures. And we regret that, because I think it would have been a much more informative evening, but that's the
I can admit you. I've debated him online all day. He showed up on a Facebook thread, and I've been asking questions, and I can tell you his answer to certain questions if you'd like.
Yeah, I don't think we want you representing him. I don't think he'd appreciate it.
No,
I'm sure
but I do think for the viewers watching on that, it is also fair to note that Elliot did agree to this originally, and he backed out of it last night.
Yeah.
And that seemed to have been after several other reports came out about him and his initiatives, that he did not feel any more secure in being able to defend himself as to why these measures will be good in these cities.
So back to this revenue potential these two measures offer. Jonatan, you mentioned before we started speaking this evening that the average retail cannabis store has $2.5 million in annual revenue.
That's what the state data is showing us. Yes.
And is that a realistic number for beach cities?
The challenge is there's so many variables right now, right? So originally, let's say if Redondo was the first one here, would have been just Redondo servicing all of the South Bay? Would delivery companies been a part of that as well too? What happens now that if we have all of the beach cities coming online as well too? So to actually have that figure as to what would come into these cities, it's really difficult to put that out there. I think the more important thing is to recognize that revenue will be made for these, and that the cities should be able to get tax revenues off of that, and that all of these measures provide absolutely no tax to the city itself. They claim they do, but they don't.
But the cities have the ability, they have to go back to the voters in the subsequent election.
Yes.
But they have the ability to impose a tax if these measures pass.
They could, but this group decided not to do that. And in Redondo Beach, they went so far when they were called out for that to actually introduce a second ballot initiative in hopes of being apologetic to the city for doing and getting caught for that. And yet they didn't follow through with it, and they pulled it in the end.
I think in their defense, they approached the cities and said, we are happy to negotiate the language of these ballot measures to include a tax. The cities declined the offer to negotiate.
I'm pretty sure. And
as a result, they said, fine, we won't have a tax. Now, Hermosa, as you mentioned, has passed the tax, I think.
They did, didn't they?
Assuming,
or is it on the ballot?
It's on the ballot.
On the ballot,
it's on the ballot, that's correct. And if these stores were to do, say, $2 million, 10% would be 200,000. If the tax was 5%, it'd be 100,000. So it's a fair assumption that the city that passes these initiatives is going to get somewhere between 200,000 plus in tax revenue.
Yeah.
The city that passes these initiatives, not as they are though, because they don't have a tax with them.
Assuming they get the tax that they are asking for. And both, in Hermosa, my recollection, and Redondo too, the councils discussed the concern that all these cities have had. that if the tax is too high, it pushes buyers out of the retailer and into the illegal market.
Yeah.
So is that a concern you would have with
No,
cities?
this is resolvable, right? So, this is where we did it. In Redondo Beach, we started with a development agreement because we didn't see, the goal was for Redondo to come online much sooner, and it wouldn't have been within an election cycle to have a tax come up. So we wanted to be able to provide for that tax revenue originally, hence a development agreement. A development agreement allows the city to change that fee, 5%, lower, higher, whatever they need to in time. In Hermosa Beach, they did the similar stuff as well, to where they did an up to tax. So they have it up to 10%, and they can actually change it with a vote of the council. So if we find out that it's too high, they can lower it, and vice versa.
If the measures pass, what do you see the consequence be?
Twofold. I think if the measures pass, I will not be surprised if you're going to see they're going to be legally challenged. And if they're going to be legally challenged, they're going to drag the cities in through quite a prolonged process and delays ultimately anything coming online.
Who's going to challenge?
I think there are people out there that do see these as being unconstitutional and being unfair, and I think we'll see that come up shortly. Secondly, I think—
Would your association be among those?
I don't think they would be, but I think that there are others out there that really understand that even better than we do. And so they would be—
There's something unconstitutional about these measures.
That seems to be the case, but we'll see as time goes.
What do you see as unconstitutional?
I'll let them speak for themselves when they come forward.
Who's they?
We'll see in time. So
do
first,
you know? Have you talked to people who said we're going to challenge these?
I am aware of people that would, yes.
And what would be their incentive, assuming it's going to be costly?
Their incentive is that they're looking for a fair market. It's not always about just a business incentive coming into this stuff.
So it's a competitor to Catalyst.
It could be. It's not necessarily a competitor, though.
Well, it's someone who's doing business who feels they're at a
No.
unfair disadvantage.
No, but I think to your point, it'd be better for them to advocate for themselves. So we'll allow that when the time comes. But secondly, I want to put out there the other thing we've seen is each of the city attorneys in each of the cities here have said that what's wrong with these measures is that they incentivize every applicant that loses to sue the city, because what they have done is they put in a backdoor for themselves, if you will, that if you lose, they can go to a judge and a judge can award additional licenses as a way to compensate them for this.
Yeah, and the city with that. So yeah, the city legal team told us in almost every meeting that the merit-based selection process that's in there now opens the city up to lawsuits and potentially very expensive suits for a bill that the city didn't even put on the ballot and didn't want.
Why not make it a lottery system?
Because the measure
Simple.
doesn't let you do that.
Well, yeah, the measure does. That's
Yeah.
a great answer. But I think there's not one solution that is going to give us the perfect outcome. But the problems with the lottery system is that you can't guarantee the best fit operators for the city itself.
True, but try to set up any kind of merit system, no matter how clean and well thought out the measure is fraught with problems. I mean, when people make requests for proposals, it's the lowest responsible bid, and arguments are made all the time that the lowest responsible bid isn't always the best bid.
Yeah.
But that's the best solution that public agencies have come up with to award valuable assets like a license to do business.
And you just answered your question about why the city might have put a ban in place in the first place, is they just don't want to deal with this at all.
And we've seen this. This group itself has sued on those grounds itself. So when they have a merit-based process that they're proposing, and they built in their own backdoor to be able to sue on that should they lose in their own merit process. They've learned this in all the other cities that they brought lawsuits in for it as well in hopes of gaining themselves a license throughout that lawsuit.
Okay, those are sort of in the weeds concerns that public officials need to have. But as a resident, someone opens a marijuana dispensary at 2nd and PCH, where there happens to be a bar now.
Yep.
As a resident, and maybe I'm not a user, maybe I'm a casual user, maybe I use it all the time. Do I care? I mean, am I going to be when a city councilman got elected by campaigning against tattoo parlors? And actually, it was the guy in Hermosa Beach who sued, and I think it went to the state Supreme Court, to allow him to open a tattoo parlor, because why should he be allowed to open a tattoo parlor? There's, I think, 4 or 5 tattoo parlors in Hermosa. I have not heard anybody complain about them. Is this analogous?
No. Tattoo is not a controlled substance.
No.
The tattoo is not a controlled substance. You can't. So it's interesting you bring that up, because a lot of the detractors on Measure M are the exact same people who acted like the world was going to come to an end if the tattoo parlors opened. And one of the things I'm struggling with is trying to make sure that the things about this measure, such as not allowing outside delivery into Hermosa anymore, it would only be these two shops that are authorized by Measure M that would be able to deliver in Hermosa, and things like the council, if it turns out they do bring crime, if they do cause problems, if we do see a spike in youth use, we can't close them. The council is specifically forbidden from rescinding those licenses in those cases. So when those things get pushed aside, because you've got some fairly hyperbolic people who are anti-cannabis in general, it's very easy to make that connection you just made, where it's like, well, these same people said that if we put the dining desks on Pier Avenue, we'd have terrible traffic problems, and we don't.
Oh, I do.
And well, but
No, I love the
yeah,
next.
yeah,
But,
yeah.
let me go into the delivery issue. Anyone can, in Hermosa, is starting, I think, in this month, right?
October 13th, I think.
Okay. You can legally deliver and you can legally receive
Correct.
cannabis. And is there any regulation on who can deliver cannabis to our Hermosa residents?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the city council has put forward a permitting process. So you have to sign up for it and follow their guidelines for it. You have to be a legally licensed delivery service by the state as well, which means that they are coming out of another city that already allows for delivery sales itself. They're coming into the city here. That being said, those sales are also monitored through a track and trace system. So that way we know what is being sold, whom it's being sold to, or sold through, if you will. And we also know the state ends up falling in there to where there are also limitations as to how much product can actually be put into these vehicles themselves.
So is it true that the vehicles that deliver the cannabis are not allowed to have signage?
It's true. They're very discreet.
And why?
They're very
And
discreet.
why is that?
Well, for
And,
instance,
and
it's what
isn't
Russ
that a violation of some sort of free
No.
speech?
No, and you know what? Quite frankly, it's really good security policies. If you understand, and we all said earlier that this is a cash-based business, why would you want to advertise? I mean, you see that on a Pizza Hut delivery car that says, "I only got."
Everybody else wants to advertise.
But you wouldn't want to advertise that you have
business.
$5,000 to $10,000 worth of product in your car and potentially that amount of cash.
Pizza guy, he's got the same issue. He
doesn't
doesn't
carry
have $10,000.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
okay.
I have a question from a viewer. Does Hermosa or Redondo have language in their ordinances forbidding landlord gouging? Ventura included it in their ordinance.
Yeah.
So
let's pass on that question. It's a whole other issue. It's for another evening's debate on landlord rights.
Well, that's fair, but I do want to say in Redondo Beach, we had specifically not required a property so that we wouldn't have that issue. So you can apply for a license when the time comes in Redondo, and you will not have that gouging issue because you are not required to have that property at the time of the application. And in Hermosa, we're starting with delivery, so there's not even an issue there whether you have the property or not.
Yeah. Are there restrictions on the delivery in Hermosa and Redondo?
Oh, well, we were just saying right now, we've repealed them, right? So in Hermosa Beach, restrictions have been repealed off of that, if you mean on that end. Beyond that, what other restrictions would you see forward?
Well, you've already said they need to register and they need to, their sales are going to be tracked.
And in Redondo Beach,
I actually think they did impose restrictions on hours of delivery.
I think there were maybe early in the mornings. We saw some of that stuff. In the state allows from 6 a.m. till 10 p.m.
Okay.
For Redondo Beach, we did allow for delivery to be delivered that early in the morning.
And has anyone looked at the potential revenue? Is Hermosa's initiative, assuming its measure on taxation passes, and I can't imagine why it wouldn't, done a projection on what the delivery revenue would be, assuming the tax passes?
We won't, but this is why it's going to be such a great opportunity to start this way. Now we're going to have actual licensed operators coming in, being able to track that data and being able to pay that so we can know what's in there. The other part, maybe I heard your question a little earlier wrong on that. Hermosa Beach is also looking into putting in a penalty. I don't know if they've passed it yet, but I believe the penalty, if you operate within a city without a license, would be up to $30,000 per time you get caught.
Yeah, no, I think they did.
Yeah.
And it seemed pretty draconian, but.
Well, it's incentive, and the first one's meant to be an incentive. That way, if you do have that caught, come in and get the live permit and you won't be fined on
Yeah,
that.
I understand. What else do we need to discuss?
Well, I think there's a couple things, if you don't mind, on the stuff on there.
Go ahead.
The proponents of the initiative, especially in Redondo Beach, have put out flyers recently. And those flyers have mistruths, if not half-truths, if not even full-out not being truthful at all. There's really three things that that the flyers are saying on there that the initiative does, and that's not true. One of them says it's going to bring in $2 million worth of tax revenues to the city. There is absolutely no tax associated with their measure. I want to be clear about that. There is no tax on the measure in Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, or in Manhattan Beach. Do not believe those flyers, what they say on there. The second one on there is that it ends up keeping local control on the stuff going forward. That is also not accurate. When it comes to retail cannabis shops, the local control is completely gone. The city council cannot determine where they're going. The city council cannot say how many are going to be there. They cannot even take how many are there less than that if they want to in the future. All local control of retail sales of cannabis within the cities is completely gone. And the last one on there that I thought it was pretty creative of them, but it was entirely inaccurate, was that it was the only measure in Redondo Beach that would keep it a certain distance from schools. That's only half true. There is only one measure, it's theirs. The city has passed its own ordinance, and its own ordinance actually puts dispensaries further away from schools than what Measure E does in Redondo Beach. Those are three half-truths at best, if not completely mistruths, that they're trying to put out there, and I want to make sure that the voters understand that. This group is doing everything they can to be able to pass this to their own benefit, and they do not care about our cities.
But what's your thought on measures? I think it's Z in Manhattan Beach, and I think it was put on by the council and would ban retail cannabis sales.
I can give you my personal opinion on that.
Yeah.
My personal opinion is that they were cornered in a wall to deal with this on a time schedule that didn't work well for them. And it became controversial when one of their council members was discovered to be taking a payment from this group. And once that was out there, it seemed to be more beneficial for the city council to say, hey, you know what, there is no cannabis corruption going on. We're not part of this stuff. We're going to swing completely in the opposite direction.
Now, isn't that likely to be found unconstitutional?
Why?
Banning? Well, sooner or later, someone like the tattoo parlor owners is going to sue a city and say, we have a legal right to sell cannabis.
So Prop 64 allowed for local control. And local control means that if the local jurisdiction decides to prohibit this, they have that right to do that.
So you think Measure Z, should it pass, will stand until someone who advocates lifting the ban gets a ballot measure that passes?
Most likely. And preferably, if there ever is something like that in the future, it'd be one that would actually benefit the city and not the one that's being put on by Catalyst.
And does Measure Z prohibit delivery?
It does.
You know? Yeah.
It does.
What are your thoughts? I asked you, what's your thought on that?
On prohibiting delivery? Well, we talked about it in great detail. So the first thing I'd say is Chief LeBaron spoke about this, and he said that there's not really a practical way for them to enforce a delivery ban other than doing sting operations. And they wouldn't really go to the expense and effort to do a sting operation unless there was some kind of issue that came up related to illegal delivery. And then he said they're very well aware that it's going on. Mike DeToy told an anecdote where he was literally sitting and watched a cannabis delivery happen right in front of him, called the chief of police to report it. And they said, you know, I'm not going to take somebody who's currently looking for burglaries or drunk driving and assign them to that. Like they just don't have the manpower to make a big deal about it. And then then the other thing he said is, we know that this has been happening in the city since Prop 64 passed. And to date, we have had 0 calls saying that it's caused a problem, which is why it's pretty far down on their list of priorities of things to worry about. So I think personally, delivery is probably one of the safest and most effective ways to guarantee any kind of access to it. And it's also, you know, convenient. I don't really see much of a downside.
Assuming Measure M in Hermosa fails, what do you anticipate this city's next step being? They're not getting any tax revenue. Oh yeah, they're getting the tax revenue on the delivery.
Yep.
Do you think they're just going to let it drop, or do you think they'll come forward with their own measure?
I think our city right now has a lot on its plate, and this is nowhere near the top of the list. And so if you had a residents group or you had a local business person who was into this and wanted to get it done and wanted to champion it, I could see the city starting to take time on it. To date, I've sat in on all the cannabis committee meetings and I think every council meeting where this has been discussed. We've not seen a single person call in saying they cannot get cannabis, they want a dispensary, or really anything. The only ones who are really driving this are the Measure M people. And the other thing that we haven't really touched on is the language of Measure M requires the city to prioritize approving these licenses and putting all these systems in place in a very short amount of time, something like 30, 60 days or something. Yeah. And it says it has to take precedence over wastewater. It has to take precedence over homeless. It has to take precedence over crime and the pier and all that. And just nobody wants that. Whether or not this happens in the future, it shouldn't be happening like this. And if it does happen, it needs to be driven by city management and city government, and not an ordinance that restricts what they can even do if there is a problem, which is what Measure M is.
If it fails in Redondo, how do you see the city proceeding on this issue?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to roll this out responsibly, right? So we're starting slow. In Hermosa, that means they're starting with delivery. In Redondo Beach, it means starting with 2 shops. When we see over time, a year or so of them actually operating, that things maybe have been done all right and things are good, I anticipate that we can expand into other things. Either that might mean that we're going to allow for more shops if there's a need for that. There might be other types of activities such as cannabis events. There are also cannabis lounges. I think that's going to be something that'll be problematic in the future. In our beach cities here, for those of you that may or may not know, Prop 64 legalizes the consumption within our own single family home. So you are protected for that. But in a multi-unit housing, landlords and HOAs can actually prohibit the use of the cannabis. So if the city ends up legalizing the use, we anticipate over time that people are going to be probably having it be problematic. And the best way to actually allow for them to use it responsibly would be to allow for cannabis cafes.
When would Redondo's allowance for 2 retailers go into effect?
We anticipate as of right now, so if Measure E fails, as we think it will fail in Redondo Beach, then the next step on that will be putting in the selection process as well as the application process, which should be done and finished by the spring of next year.
So all the issues that Russ in particular raised about regulatory concerns, lawsuit concerns over the awarding of the retail permits, is Redondo concerned about that? I mean, why aren't they going to have the problems that Russ is saying Hermosa would have?
I won't say they won't have those problems. I think we've mitigated against them a lot of those. So the committee over there took a lot of time to be able to study a lot of other cities that have gone through this process, and we have been able to learn best practices from them. Part of the challenges have been that they are, some of these questions are very subjective. They'll say, hey, show us your designs. What does your shop look like? The people that are grading them might prefer pink colored shop over a blue colored shop. And it's simple as that, which then ends up leading to lawsuits. So the types of questions have to be more objective in the process to ensure that we're going to have the best fit operators and also not encourage lawsuits going in for that. We've done a lot of work on that going forward in Redondo Beach. And I think Redondo Beach is going to be well suited to be able to push their selection process responsibly forward.
Let me give an example of what's in the merit-based process that Measure M has. So it'll say something like, it'll say that the dispensary needs to have a security system without putting any kind of specifics on what goes into that and what happens if they don't. So you could have correct me if I'm wrong here, because it's been a couple months now since I read the ordinance, but you could submit and say, hey, we've got a security system. And this other person could say, yeah, we've got a bank vault and man traps and all of this stuff. And if for whatever reason the other person gets it, now the person with the better security system, even though they both adhere to the letter of that provision, now they might want to sue and say this wasn't a fair process.
And I'll expand on that. I think the other thing, and I want to be clear to anyone watching and listening here, each of these measures, he'll say Measure M in Hermosa, Measure E in Redondo, Measure MB in Manhattan Beach. They're all the same. They're all virtually the same in every way because they're all run by the same group here. So when he says something's wrong in his, it's the same that's wrong in all the other cities as well. One of the things on that point is that it also expands on, it says that it gives extra points in the process if you end up promising that you're going to give 2% of your sales to a nonprofit. But there's no way of enforcing that. Each of the city attorneys have said that. It's like, great, you've promised this, but we have no mechanism now that if you don't do that, that we can yank your license.
Hermosa and Manhattan's council were very careful to avoid appearing to support marijuana sales. Hermosa, I think it was a 4-1 vote to put the marijuana tax on. And
It's unanimous and 4-1 for delivery. It's unanimous for the tax.
You know what's,
Yeah.
Okay. But the concern, and also in Manhattan, was should we put an alternative measure on the ballot, do something similar to what Redondo did? There's the inference to be drawn that we support the sale of marijuana in our towns. So as it sits now, if those 3 measures fail, Hermosa and Manhattan will not have retail sales. Redondo will have retail sales. Redondo's already struggles with something of an inferiority complex in terms of optics. And now it's the town where you can go buy marijuana, and we don't want our children to go there. Is that
I
ring
disagree
true at all?
No, I disagree that wholly. And I think this is one of the things that's really
Am I
interesting.
showing my age?
No, not at all. I think that you bring up a good point. I think this is what people, and I think what this group that came in and attacked our cities here really misunderstood. Prop 64 did not answer the question of whether we wanted it in our cities. It allowed us the ability to have that discussion. And we were starting that discussion. We're well on the way in Redondo Beach before these guys tried to usurp it. In Hermosa Beach, they had to start it faster on that, right? So we've got the stuff going in there. What we've seen now in surveys that have come back, Hermosa Beach is a great example. Hermosa Beach was the second, if not third, highest city in the county that voted in favor of Prop 64. And yet here we are 6 years later after legalization, right? Less than that, 4 years or so since we started really the sales and stuff in there. And the survey came back showing that the residents here are still split, practically split 50-50 whether or not they want it here in the cities.
Oh, they favored it.
They favored it at 53%, but there was a
5%.
5%. There was a
Yeah,
5%
margin
margin
of
of error. Yeah.
No, I voted.
So it was a split. And in Redondo Beach, we saw similar too, which is why it's so important that if we're going to go with this, we need to start in a way that we can be able to expand it responsibly or pull it back if we went wrong. These measures will lock this in. They do not give us that opportunity to be able to correct the course if we find out it wasn't right.
Have you got any closing comments you want to make? Anything we've overlooked? Because we've been at this for almost an hour.
There are a couple of questions.
Yeah, I'd love
here.
to take some of
Okay.
those.
All right.
Go ahead,
Boy, there's actually a lot. This was the landlord. We asked this one. More about Elliott. Has the recall candidate Elliott Lewis of Catalyst Cannabis sponsored to run in Redondo Beach District 4 state if she is for or against Measure E? Seems fishy that they have refused to comment either way.
I will tell you, I have spoken to that candidate and they have refused to give an answer on that. I don't know that that is necessarily the best answer when you're looking to be a leader here going forward, but it is really curious to me, considering that Elliott Lewis has paid for all the measures in each of these cities, including the recall, that candidate has not even come to support his own measure.
So the viewers who are not familiar with Redondo politics can understand there's a Zane Obaji, who is the District 4 councilman, which is North Redondo, is on a October 19 ballot in Redondo Beach for a recall. Also on that ballot is the cannabis measure.
Yeah.
E.
Yes.
Catalyst has paid to get the measure qualified for the ballot that would repeal the ban on cannabis sales, and also paid for the petitioners to get the recall of Councilman Obaji on the ballot, and spent $300,000. They're not a casual investment.
And they also
Those people.
go on Instagram touting it as what happens if you don't do what they say.
Yeah.
I can't verify that.
I'll send you the link.
I'll verify.
But that is the issue. And if he is recalled, there's only one challenger on the ballot, and essentially by default, that person would become the 4th District councilman. And the question that is being raised by the commenter online is whether that person has spoken in favor of or in opposition to the cannabis measure. And obviously the inference being drawn is that she's not speaking out because she doesn't want to offend her sponsor. But there's no evidence that he's contributed to her campaign.
The other question is about how to apply for a license. Do you see that, Russ?
Yeah, it says, how can a local business person who has lived in the city for decades be able to apply? How are these ordinances fair to the people of this community? I have my opinion, but
I'll just say on that, I think you said that, or it was in sort of, it's not fair to our community, plain and simple. The current selection process as defined in these measures would virtually exclude every single resident in here from being able to qualify to be able to have a business or the opportunity to have a business in their own communities.
Now, is there anything that would stop, say, a smoke shop in Hermosa Beach from inviting investors to give them the capital that is required of that, of measure?
none of the smoke
Yeah.
shops are zoned, like they wouldn't be able to, unless they're,
location, okay.
yeah.
All right.
There's that, but there's also a number of other things on there that this group has really, unfortunately, twisted to their advantage. There's a number of processes in here that would apply to them, such as what they claim to be fair labor practices. What they've done is they've actually abused what is fair labor practices, and they have in there to where it is a requirement or it's an opportunity to gain more points in the system. That if you are already an existing operator who already has a organized labor agreement in place, you get more of an opportunity and more points in here to be able to win the license in here. Imagine if you're a new business here, like your smoke shop in here, that never was a cannabis business and never had that opportunity. How is that fair?
Closing comments?
We got one more question, actually.
Oh, sure.
Did any of the proponents participate or engage the community in Hermosa or Redondo before they wrote these initiatives?
To my knowledge, absolutely not. In Redondo Beach, I can tell you we've had our committee in 2019. We never once had it until we were absolutely served these initiatives going forward. They never once came afterwards to set up any kind of community discussions, and it was not their intent. I've heard stories of how they came into Hermosa Beach and other cities as well too, and they tried to really bully their way through into it as opposed to having a conversation.
Yeah, that's consistent with what we talked about at the cannabis committee. Basically, this came out of left field. The first that anybody heard about it is when the initiative was filed by a resident who was completely MIA, and there's actually now some question as to whether he was even a resident at the time that he filed that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Just
Tons, but what do we have time for?
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, let's do some closing comments because it's late.
Sure. I'll start off by saying vote no on Measure E in Redondo Beach, vote no on Measure M in Hermosa Beach, vote no on Measure MB in Manhattan Beach. These are not fair. These are not right for our communities. Hermosa Beach and Redondo Beach have already put forward their own ordinances, protect our cities, and make sure that these special interest outsiders do not come in and take the funds from our cities to benefit themselves.
what he said.
Okay.
I couldn't say it better than that.
And in closing, first, thank those of you who watched. Thank you, Jonatan and Russ. I point out that the ballot measures in Manhattan and Hermosa are November 8th, along with the general election. Redondo Beach, for reasons too complicated to explain this evening, that its election is October 19th, which is a Wednesday. And with that, I think
Make sure you drop off your ballots in the mailboxes.
Thank you, everybody.